The last war continued. The world after the war was not the same. It was no longer a place of simple survivors and fragile hope. The bombs had not been the only things to scar the land. Hidden deep within the violent chaos of the final days, a much darker consequence had begun to unfold. As if the earth itself had been contaminated by the bloodshed, strange mutations began to surface among the surviving population. At first, it was subtle. Small signs that might have been brushed off as coincidence. A man in New York with an extra finger, a woman in London whose eyes glowed faintly in the dark. But within weeks of the EMP blast, the mutations began to accelerate. They weren't just physical. These mutants, as they would soon be known, seemed to be changing on a cellular level, as if the very DNA of humanity had been altered by the unrestrained violence and the fallout from nuclear detonations, EMP waves, and the spread of toxic chemicals. Nadia had witnessed the changes firsthand. What had once been a group of dedicated, hopeful scientists working in makeshift laboratories to rebuild the old world was now a ragtag group of survivors, their research centers overrun by the very thing they had hoped to avoid. The energy source she had been working on, the one she thought could be a key to salvation, had inadvertently caused a surge in the mutation rates. It was something she could never have predicted. One night, as she sat by a flickering fire with her team, a girl, barely 10 years old, approached the group. Her skin shimmered under the moonlight, silver and translucent like liquid mercury. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, glowed an eerie green. She reached out, her fingers elongated and spindly, as if they were reaching for something just beyond reach. Nadia stiffened, her heart pounding. The girl spoke, but her voice was distorted, garbled, as though spoken underwater. "I want to help." Nadia's heart sank. The girl's mutation was unlike anything they had seen before. Her body was shifting, warping, in unnatural ways. Her form seemed to flicker between states, like a malfunctioning hologram. The girl's condition wasn't just a physical mutation. It was as if the virus of war had infected her very soul. "You're one of them," Nadia whispered, though she didn't know whether she meant the girl or the silent, haunting mass of creatures she had only heard rumors of. The mutants, as they were called, were not all the same. Some, like the girl, seemed to retain fragments of their humanity, struggling against the changes overtaking them. Others were not so fortunate. Their bodies had transformed into grotesque caricatures of human form, clawed hands, extra limbs, mouths that opened too wide to be natural. These creatures were mindless, driven by some primal instinct, a survival mechanism forced by the changes to their very being. In the weeks following the first encounter, the full scope of the mutation crisis became apparent. Nadia, along with the rest of the survivors, began to understand that these mutants were not simply victims of genetic accidents. They were a new species entirely. And they weren't all human anymore. Many had evolved beyond their former selves into something other. In the distant wastelands of what had been California, where the survivors had once fought off an army of scavengers, the mutants had begun to organize. The first reports had come from the ruins of Los Angeles. Strange, inhuman figures working in groups, communicating in ways that defied logic. They had weapons, primitive but effective, fashioned from the remnants of old war machines. But what was more terrifying was that they weren't attacking people randomly. They were hunting down specific targets. Scientists, engineers, leaders, anyone who might pose a threat to their growing dominance. Emily, in the ruins of what had once been a thriving East Coast community, heard whispers from surviving refugees about the mutant queen. She was said to have been one of the first mutants to undergo a change, a woman whose mutations had granted her incredible intelligence and telepathic abilities. Some believed she was the one organizing the mutant armies, guiding them with a strange, almost prophetic vision. But the mutants were not the only threat to humanity now. The old survivors, those who had not been mutated, had become just as dangerous. They had formed tribes, militias, and coalitions, clinging to old-world ideologies, but without the structure of a functioning government. Every group was an island unto itself, and the cruelty of their new existence had made them vicious. They fought one another for scraps of food, remnants of old technology, and territory. Their numbers were growing, but so were the mutants, and soon, both factions would collide in a conflict that could decide the future of what remained of humanity. Meanwhile, far across the ocean, Admiral Cheng and his coalition were struggling with the question of what to do with the mutants. For some, They were an abomination, a curse upon a world already broken beyond repair. For others, they were the next step in human evolution, something that could be harnessed, even controlled. Cheng had received reports that the mutant forces had started to move east, and they were heading toward the Pacific. He knew that any confrontation with them would likely be the end for the human race as it had once been. And yet, there was no option but to fight. To resist. Are we too far gone? Admiral Cheng muttered to himself, staring out over the vast, unbroken ocean. It had been days since they last saw a ship or received news from the mainland. The sky above seemed perpetually dark now, choked with ash from the fallout and the endless fires that raged across the world. He could already feel the winds of war shifting again. This time, there would be no limits, no negotiations. The mutants, with their unpredictable powers and unnatural abilities, were unlike anything the human race had faced. And they were spreading. Nadia's research, once a symbol of hope, was now a dangerous wild card in a world that could barely hold on to its sanity. She had created something, but she didn't know what it was anymore. The energy source that could save the world had begun to ripple through the mutated, feeding them, amplifying their strange powers. The mutant queen, if she existed, was just one example of what this energy had created. With each new mutation, the boundary between man and monster blurred further. Nadia had one final option: to destroy the energy source, to undo the damage she had caused, before it could reach the mutants and change the world completely. But in doing so, she would be condemning her people to a slow death, cut off from the resources they needed to survive. In the ruined cities, in the shattered landscapes, and under the watchful eyes of the mutants, Nadia made her decision. She would not let humanity fall completely, but neither would she allow the mutants to replace them. As the sun set on the horizon, and the world stood on the brink of a new kind of war, one thing was certain. The battle was no longer for a planet that could support human life. It was a fight to preserve what remained of the human spirit, the fragile, stubborn fire that refused to go out. The mutants might have been born of war, but humanity's will to survive would be their greatest enemy. And the next chapter of this world's history had only just begun.